For the first time in 6 years, China has imported soybean meal from Argentina, a significant volume of 30,000 tons. This move has not only invigorated Argentina, but also heightened anxiety in the United States. During Donald Trump's first term, the U.S. initiated a trade war with China, prompting China to gradually reduce its reliance on American goods. With the start of Trump 2.0, the U.S.-China tariff war has reignited, and China's efforts to diversify its supply chains have accelerated. The most telling sign of this shift is China's unexpected restructuring of its supply chains. In just over a month, China has reduced or even halted imports from the U.S. in various sectors, including liquefied natural gas, oil, meat, and soybeans. Instead, China has finalized procurement contracts with other countries, causing considerable concern in the U.S. Adding to this, China's stricter controls on rare earth exports have led Trump to repeatedly call for negotiations. Despite some tariff talks, the trade situation between the two nations remains tense. Against this backdrop, China has made another strategic move. On June 28, China signed a soybean meal purchase agreement with Argentina for 30,000 tons at $360 per ton, with shipment expected in July and arrival in China by September. While the scale of this transaction isn't astounding, its significance is amplified in today's highly strained global supply chain environment. China is the world's largest consumer of soybean meal, a fundamental ingredient in animal feed and crucial for its livestock industry. Traditionally, China has imported soybeans, primarily from Brazil and the US, for domestic crushing into soybean meal. This direct import of finished soybean meal from Argentina indicates a fundamental change in China's decision-making regarding critical agricultural product supply chains. China is actively seeking alternative solutions from source to end user, aiming to diversify risks across crushing and transportation. Deeper reflection reveals this as a systematic defense against uncertainty. The current U.S.-China economic relationship is highly unstable and susceptible to political influence, making it a high-risk variable. Regardless of the outcome of U.S.-China negotiations, China's trend of supply chain restructuring will persist. The world is becoming increasingly complex, and China is acutely aware that relying on a single country for a specific product significantly increases uncertainty. China's approach to the global agricultural market has entered a new phase of global procurement. While Brazil remains a major soybean supplier, its production growth has limits. China is now eyeing Argentina, Russia, and even some African countries as potential strategic supply chain backups, accelerating their development. In other words, China isn't shifting its allegiance to any single country. It's orchestrating a multi-point balance chessboard. Previously, China had little leverage in the buyer's market and was often chosen by others. Now, it's different. China is actively choosing its partners. This represents China's reassertion of control over its own destiny amidst an unstable globalization. The soybean meal deal is just the tip of the iceberg. This means China needs to take steps to mitigate potential risks before they materialize, making supply chain expansion imperative. More directly, China's actions are related to the U.S.-China tariff war, but the tariff war isn't the sole influencing factor. China is signaling to the U.S. that America's ability to exert pressure through trade leverage is diminishing. This latest import from Argentina deprives the U.S. of a key bargaining chip. For a long time, U.S. agricultural products, especially soybeans, have been a significant leverage point for American pressure in trade negotiations. The U.S. government felt confident in its repeated maximum pressure tactics because it believed China couldn't do without American soybeans. However, China is gradually dismantling this notion. The entry of Argentine soybean meal into the Chinese market is, to some extent, an open countermeasure. While the U.S. attempts to use agricultural products as a bargaining chip, China is opting to reduce its reliance and forge new partnerships. The most anxious party in this trade dynamic is actually American farmers. U.S. Midwest states, whose economies are heavily dependent on soybeans, have long relied on the Chinese market. If Chinese orders are diverted to Argentina, Brazil, or even Russia, farmers' incomes will sharply decline. After the first round of US-China negotiations, the US did not relent, instead escalating its suppression of China through various means. Trump's plan was to create leverage for negotiations with China. However, he underestimated China's resolve. In the second round of London negotiations, although a framework agreement was reached, China did not ease its controls on rare earths. Now, China is increasing its imports of agricultural products from other countries, undoubtedly intensifying Trump's anxiety. As a result, Trump's stance has finally shifted. The US had previously suspended ethane exports to China, but has now resumed them. Undeniably, every step China has taken since the US-China tariff war has hit a raw nerve in the US. America desires to contain China, but is forced to accept China's demands. There is no doubt that America's containment strategy has a major flaw. In the future, China will continue to seize the initiative in its interactions with the US. Recently, US President Donald Trump stated that he has found a group of very rich buyers for TikTok's US operations. Although Trump refused to disclose their identities, the American companies that have expressed interest are limited to a few, including Blackstone and Oracle. Here are 2 points on this development. First, this isn't the first time the US has targeted TikTok. Last year, during the Biden administration, the US passed legislation to force TikTok to sell or face a ban. When Trump took office, he showed some friendly signals towards China, extending the deadline for the sale 3 times, but never withdrawing the bill. This was essentially giving China time to consider, hoping for approval. Now, Trump's announcement about having found buyers is clearly intended to exert greater pressure on China and signal that the Trump administration is committed to enforcing this. Second, the sell or ban ultimatum presents 2 distinct choices. The Trump administration is pushing for a sale because banning TikTok would be detrimental to the US. For one, TikTok complies with US regulations and rose to prominence in the US market purely through its own merits, becoming a phenomenon. If the US were to ban a legally operating and compliant TikTok, it would undoubtedly negatively impact the US business environment. In such a scenario, foreign companies would at least become more cautious about investing in the US, if not outright unwilling. Secondly, if Trump were to ban TikTok, he would completely alienate China. Given the current situation, Trump is still engaged in trade negotiations with China, aiming to ease trade relations between the 2 countries. In this context, Trump will not completely antagonize China. Moreover, TikTok has operated in the US for many years and has a large base of loyal users. If Trump bans TikTok, these users would likely withdraw their support for him. With the US midterm elections approaching next year, Trump cannot afford to jeopardize his approval ratings. Finally, against the backdrop of serious US economic issues and a government debt exceeding $36 trillion, TikTok has created numerous jobs in the US and paid taxes on time, contributing to American society and economic development. If Trump still insists on banning TikTok, a large number of its American employees would face layoffs, which would undoubtedly be a significant loss to the US economy. It's worth noting that the White House recently announced it was planning a visit by Trump to China, with a delegation of dozens of multinational corporate CEOs. What does this mean? Connecting it to Trump's visit to the Middle East in May makes it easier to understand. At that time, Trump brought over 30 American business leaders to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, leading to over $2 trillion in deals. Trump clearly enjoyed that success and is now planning to repeat the tactic by bringing a delegation to China, hoping China will place large orders with the US. Therefore, if Trump were to ban TikTok before his planned visit to China, the cracks in US-China trade trust would widen further, making his visit, let alone securing major orders from China, highly unlikely. One could say Trump is caught between a rock and a hard place. The unrest in California has already caused significant social upheaval in the U.S., with countless protests and millions of Americans taking to the streets to protest the federal government's immigration policies. In this situation, Trump should exercise caution regarding TikTok. Otherwise, it's not impossible that the California government could seize the opportunity to rally more public opposition against Trump. In fact, China has been observing Trump's pressure on TikTok and will not allow him to act recklessly. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has stated that the U.S. should provide an open, fair, just, and non-discriminatory business environment for market entities from all countries operating in the U.S. These four words: open, fair, just, and non-discriminatory say it all. Just hours after the G7 summit in Canada, where Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appeared to be getting along, Trump suddenly changed his tune after returning from the NATO summit in The Hague. Trump lambasted Canada and announced an immediate halt to all trade negotiations with Canada. Trump stated, "We have just learned that Canada has announced it will impose a digital services tax on American technology companies. This is a direct and blatant attack on our country. Due to this very egregious tax, we are terminating all trade discussions with Canada, effective immediately." He continued, "We will make Canada aware within 7 days how much tariff they will have to pay to do business with the United States." Trump later added at the White House, "Canada is making a foolish mistake. All the cards are in our hands." He also described Canada as a very difficult country to do business with, noting its long-standing 400% tariffs on U.S. dairy products and the recent digital services tax, which he suggested was mimicking the EU. In short, the 400% dairy tariffs had already irked Trump, and the new digital tax pushed him over the edge. The Digital Services Tax (DST), while seemingly a tax, strikes at the heart of American interests. First, it directly impacts U.S. tech giants like Google and Amazon, who have profited for years in the Canadian market and will now see a significant chunk of their profits eroded. Trump cares deeply about these companies, as they are major donors and voter bases. Facebook and Google have reportedly lobbied quietly, threatening to cut political donations to Trump if the DST isn't stopped. Without this funding, Trump's campaign coffers would be exposed. Therefore, Trump's immediate termination of negotiations is a clear sign of loyalty to Silicon Valley. Secondly, this tax could undermine the US-led global tax system. The DST is based on the principle that users who contribute to value creation should be taxed, which sounds reasonable. However, in Trump's words, it's unilateralism that undermines WTO rules and traditional approaches of the OECD. It's clear that Trump has framed a tax issue as a national security crisis, using exaggerated language that reveals his boundless protection of American interests. Given that many Western countries are currently imposing digital services taxes, why did Trump single out Canada? Trump's move against Canada is primarily intended to exert precise deterrence through the digital services tax issue, backed by a triple strategic consideration. To make an example, targeting Canada maximizes the deterrent effect on other countries like the UK, France, and Germany, who are also considering digital taxes. Domestic political mobilization. Trump needs to demonstrate a tough stance before the July 8 deadline for retaliatory tariffs to appeal to his America First voter base. To build a moat around tech hegemony, in Trump's view, if even America's closest neighbor bows down, the resistance of other countries will be significantly weakened. Canadian Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland previously announced that the digital services tax would take effect on June 30th and would not be delayed. How does Canada view Trump's pressure? Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stated that the Canadian government would continue these complex negotiations with the U.S. for the best interests of Canadian workers and businesses. Some Canadians are exasperated, noting that the decision to implement a digital tax has been public knowledge for a long time, yet Trump claimed to have just learned about it. They view this more as extreme pressure, a pretext to pick a fight with Canada and create leverage for negotiations. Beyond tariff issues, since taking office, Trump has repeatedly threatened Canadian sovereignty, suggesting Canada should join the US as its 51st state. Previously, Trump also stated he believed the 1908 treaty delineating the US-Canada border was invalid and that he wanted to revise the border, asserting he would achieve this through economic power. In response to Trump's frequent annexation rhetoric, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau has repeatedly stated publicly that Canada will never join the US. During their first meeting at the White House on May 6, Trudeau reiterated that Canada would never be for sale. However, Trump then advised Trudeau face-to-face, never say never. Recently, US and Canada also clashed over security issues. On May 27, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau told the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation that for every dollar Canada spends on defense, 75 cents goes to the US, which he deemed unwise. The same day, Trump posted on social media that if Canada became the 51st state, it could enjoy free protection from the US Iron Dome missile defense system. If Canada remained an independent country, it would have to pay $61 billion for it. On June 23, Canada and the European Union signed a comprehensive security and defense agreement. According to a joint statement, the Canadian government will work with Brussels to reach a bilateral agreement on the EU's €150 billion European Security Action Plan. This marks the first time the EU has deepened its security and defense partnership with Canada. Politico Europe commented that Trudeau's move aims to reduce Canada's reliance on the US. Immediately after falling out with the US, Canada turned its attention to China. It was reported that Canadian Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne recently announced that for national security reasons, the Canadian government has ordered Chinese surveillance equipment manufacturer Hikvision to cease operations in Canada, prohibiting government departments, agencies, and state-owned companies from purchasing Hikvision products, and requiring the removal or replacement of currently used products. Less than 12 hours after its spat with the US, Canada acted against China under the pretext of national security. While ostensibly aimed at protecting domestic companies from competition with Chinese firms, the underlying motive is to appease the US and seek Trump's favor by making a sacrificial offering of China. After all, Canada is heavily reliant on the US market, and it simply cannot afford for the US to terminate all trade negotiations. Thus, it turned to target China to regain US goodwill. Regarding Canada's actions against China's Hikvision, especially when it has yet to lift tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, steel, and aluminum products, China's response was firm. On June 28, a spokesperson for the Chinese embassy in Canada stated, "We firmly oppose any erroneous practices that generalize the concept of national security, abuse state power, and discriminate against and suppress Chinese enterprises." He added that Canada's actions severely harm the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese enterprises and disrupt normal China-Canada economic and trade cooperation. China expresses strong dissatisfaction and firm opposition. China urges Canada to immediately change its course and stop its unreasonable suppression of Chinese enterprises. While this concerns a single company, it undoubtedly presents new troubles for the already turbulent China-Canada relationship. The phrase, "immediately change its course," signifies China's resolute stance, giving Canada no time to deliberate and demanding an immediate reversal of the decision, or else China has plenty of countermeasures. What is Canada's biggest challenge and threat currently? It is certainly not China. China and Canada are geographically distant, and cooperation and mutual benefit characterize their relationship. More, China still hopes Canada will be a friend, even a good friend. Conversely, the US, which Canada values most, seems to want both Canada's money and its sovereignty. In response to Canada's unreasonable actions, China has also taken firm countermeasures. Previously, for example, after Trudeau's government followed the US in imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, steel, and aluminum products, China's Ministry of Commerce announced in March that Canada's actions constituted discriminatory restrictions, affecting normal trade order and harming the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese enterprises. Therefore, the next step would be firm countermeasures. China will impose additional tariffs on some Canadian goods. I believe China's stern position sends a strong signal to Canada. China does not want a lose-lose situation with Canada, but Canada should not play with fire or act unilaterally, or it will bring trouble upon itself. That concludes today's program. If you like it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your clicks mean a lot to me. See you next time.